As I'm starting to add to my ever-growing collection of the gray hairs and the body fat, there are an increasing number of days where those ever more distant memories look real nice. Let's go back to those days where my parents were taking care of all my necessities. Those days where life wasn't so complicated. Oh, let's go back to those days of recess. Isn't there a part of you that would like to go back to? Of course, I've come a long way since then, too. At least I hope so. Some of you may disagree. A few years ago, I was volunteering to interview prospective Duke undergrads. I usually met the students in their school's guidance office, right as the day was ending. I've got to say, for those of us who aren't in the schools every day, it's uncanny walking through a school now so far removed from those days. The kids there can't just leave when they want or they need to. They're stuck there all day long. Then they're told what to study and where to be and what and when to eat. Maybe growing up does have some perks after all. Even with that realization, though, there are still those days when my mind wanders back and those younger years look awful good. We rejoined the newly liberated Israelites probably about a month, it doesn't say for sure, but about a month after their escape through the sea. In the journey recorded since then, since what we read last week when God delivered them through the sea, a large portion of those verses were dedicated to Moses and Miriam's songs of praise for God's work of liberation. Early on, the people seemed to have responded appropriately to God's mighty act of deliverance. They lifted their praises in gratitude. However, as they started their difficult journey to the Promised Land, tensions began to rise. As they entered the desert, water, as you might imagine, was scarce. After going 3 days with no new sources of water, they discovered a stream, only for it to be bitter. Even as they began to grumble, God provided a means to make the water potable, providing for the people's needs. All that's happened since before our reading today, just in the journey to where they are. As we turn the page to today's reading, the grumbling has resumed. After camping at an oasis, always nice to find an oasis in the desert, they've left and re-entered the harsh world of the desert. This time, though, it's hunger pangs that drive their anger and their frustration. I mentioned this last week. It's easy for us, often well-fed and comfortable as we are, to scoff at these new freedmen's lack of faith in God. As I mentioned last week, I bet many of us are thinking about how faithful we would have been as a member of Moses' congregation traveling through the desert. We wouldn't have cried out against God. We wouldn't have mumbled, would we? But remember, these Israelites don't have the whole story. They can't see to the end like we can. They only knew the reality before them in that moment. They were in the harsh desert, and their frail bodies needed sustenance. Remember, as we read this story so comfortably today, these men and women were fearing for their very lives. With that said, though, it amazes me to where they jump to first. What's the first thing they say? If only God would have killed us back in Egypt. They longed for the good old days of forced labor because at least the Egyptians fed them. For generations, God's children had cried out in only a few short weeks. Suddenly their chains didn't look so bad anymore. Don't we do this too, though? I mentioned earlier, how often do we long to be children again? We easily recall the highlights. We remember how easy it was, but often we forget the drawbacks, the limits in freedom, the lack of knowledge and experience gained over the years, the relationships that have been built. We often do it on a large scale too, don't we? We yearn for a simpler time, pointing back to some perfect, great, bygone era, but forgetting the hardships that many faced then and the improvements and the discoveries that have been made since. It's one of the things for the Israelites to cry out to God in their need. That's one thing for them just to say, God, I'm hungry. After all, remember, it was such cries from slavery that God heard to instigate this whole exodus. However, the people didn't just say, Lord, I'm hungry. No, they cursed the work God had done on their behalf, and they longed for the days before they knew God. As one commentary I studied put it, to wish to have continued to sit by their flesh pots of Egypt and not have been liberated by God was to reject the relationship God was establishing with his people. It was, as a man named Reverend Childs notes, not a casual gripe, but it was unbelief which has called into question God's very election of a people. You see, God's own people, only a few weeks after having witnessed God's mighty work on their behalf, remember everything that they had seen, the plagues, the sea, the cloud, the pillar. Just a few weeks after that, they were rejecting God, saying that they would rather go back to life without him. But the good news is that despite the utter ungratefulness of these people, God was uncommonly gracious to them. God loved them enough not just to hear their longings for slavery, but to instead hear only the grumblings of their tummy. God provided what Jewish tradition teaches is a full meal. And note there are no vegetables, only meat, bread, and water to sustain the people. Even as it was provided, though, it seems that the people struggled to understand that God's provision was at hand. The term manna comes phonetically from the Hebrew, simply asking, what is this? Even as God provided, the people struggled to identify God's provision right before them. As Moses and Aaron labored to lead the people and to remind them of God's goodness, Moses realized that at the heart of the people's discontent, at the heart of their grumbling, was a separation from God. God was working to build a relationship between his people and himself. He demonstrated his love and care for them through his deliverance of them from slavery, and now in meeting their needs in this journey. But they had suffered a lot. They, as we might say today, had some trust issues. Moses realized that their words pointed to still not fully knowing, and perhaps even more importantly, not fully trusting God. So Moses instructed Aaron to gather the people and to have them come directly before God. As the people called out to God, God heard them, even revealing his glory once more up in the cloud. This was just one more example to the people that God was with them. God would be with them for the long haul. As they cried out, God not only provided, but God taught them. God demonstrated to them who he was. You know, in some ways, I can be like these Israelites. I can be overwhelmed with the complexity of my life, with the complexity of the world we find ourselves in, and grumble, saying, I wish I was a kid again. The problem with that, though, is that it's like telling God, I don't care about what he's done in the years since I was a kid. To go back to my childhood is to lose everything that God has done since then. How I've grown as a person. How I've come to know God. and even some of the bad things that have matured and shaped me. When I pine for what was, I neglect how God is present with where I am right now. When I pine for what was, I neglect how God is present with me in what is. Now, spending more time at home, one of the shows that Connie and I have been watching lately is a show that maybe you've seen come on, maybe you flipped past it, but something called The Flash. Any of you ever seen that? No? Okay, didn't think so. So, spoiler alert, this is based on the DC comic about the fastest man in the world. It's a little more complicated, but you get the idea. He can run really fast. As most superheroes seem to be required to have, the Flash has a tragic backstory, having lost his mother as a child. Pretty much every superhero, I think, has lost a parent. Not long after getting his speed powers as a young adult, he realizes he can run so fast that he can go back in time. It's a comic book. Of course he can go back in time. Isn't that something you would want? The ability to go back even just a few minutes, just to fix that boneheaded thing that you did, or even to stop some horrible accident that you just didn't get to quite in time. Wouldn't that be nice? However, every time the Flash goes back to try to fix a mistake, he ends up causing unpredictable side effects. Things that once happened that no longer happen now. Despite seeing the dangers, despite a few small times of doing this, in a moment of weakness, though, he goes back all the way to his childhood. All the way back enough to save his mom. While he now gets to live with both of his parents, he realizes the removal of this formative act in his life has changed his life completely. His world now is completely different. Some relationships that anchored him never formed in this timeline. Some of the most important people that were in his life are now gone. And some people are even now dead. By trying to go backward, he lost who was with him. The Flash realizes yet again that trying to recreate what was only caused him to lose what is. Life only moves forward. Remember, this is the theme that we talked about that was developed throughout the book of Genesis, that culminated in Joseph's life. Remember, one of the big lessons of Joseph was that evil happens in this world due to human action, but God stands ready to work with us to transform it for good. Remember, Joseph's brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery, but Joseph didn't let his anger and his resentment control him. He didn't stay fixated on what had happened, what was the past, but he worked to move forward. God then used him to help feed the whole region during a famine, coming to even save his own family, his own brothers. Even when Joseph had the chance to confront his brothers, to lord his power over them, he didn't get vengeance for the past, but he reconciled his family. Joseph's life shows us that God calls us to change our futures, not our past. You see, God's feeding of his hungry children shows us that God invites us to bring our cries, our needs to him. He welcomes us to cry out to him when we're hungry or when we're overwhelmed. Whatever our needs are, God can take them, and God wants us to bring them to him. The answer, though, isn't to go backwards. The answer is to go forward with God. We face so many challenges right now. Nationally, it feels like the chasm between political ideologies is going to tear us apart. We miss what life was like before everything seemingly changed back in March. Even locally, we wonder how our community is going to change as houses pop up in fields quicker than weeds. And that's on top of what each of us, I'm sure, is facing individually. Instead of grumbling about the realities of the world now, let's name our needs before God. Instead of looking back, wishing that we could change what happened minutes or months or years ago. Let's look to the glory of God and see where God is leading us, trusting that God will provide what's required for that journey. Let's be sure to not lose sight of where we are and where we're going by looking backward. Because if you're looking backward, you can't see what's before you and you can't see what's coming. Oh God, set us free from our nostalgia.